Right now, wildfire crews across Canada are managing 582 active fires burning simultaneously across the country, 31 of them still completely out of control. That is the official government count as of this week. Just 1 month ago, at the peak of this summer's activity, that national number climbed to within striking distance of 800 fires burning at once. In one single community in northwestern Ontario, a fire moved so fast that residents say it destroyed their entire town in under an hour, forcing families to escape across a lake by boat with nothing but what they could grab on the way out. The Canadian Armed Forces has deployed Hercules transport aircraft to evacuate entire First Nations from the path of these flames, and more than 500 international firefighters flown in avance from Mexico, Costa Rica, New Zealand, and Australia have spent the summer working alongside Canadian crews just to keep pace with it. This is the full, detailed picture of Canada's 2026 wildfire season, where the numbers actually stand right now, what has already happened to the communities hit hardest, and what the rest of this season is expected to bring. No hype, no exaggeration, just what the data actually shows. Drop a comment and tell me if wildfire smoke has reached you this summer, wherever you are, because I read every one of these. If you want grounded coverage instead of panic headlines, subscribe. It is free. And a like helps this reach people who need to understand this before smoke season reaches them too. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. Let's start with where things actually stand today, according to the federal government's own most recent update. As of this week, Canada has 582 active wildfires burning nationally, including 31 classified as out of control, meaning they are actively spreading and have not been contained. For the season as a whole, Canada has now recorded 4,793 individual wildfires, which together have burned 4.1 million hectares of land. That season total is actually higher in fire count than the same point last year, when Canada had recorded 4,584 fires, slightly fewer than this year. But the area burned tells a very different story. Last year, at the same point in August, those fires had already consumed 7.7 million hectares, nearly double this year's total. In plain terms, 2026 has produced more individual ignitions than last year, but on average, each one has stayed smaller and been brought under control faster, rather than growing into the kind of massive, weeks-long megafires that dominated recent seasons. Federal officials have described current 2026 wildfire activity as sitting below the 5-year average overall, even while acknowledging that fire danger will remain high through the rest of summer and into early fall. That 582 figure, as serious as it already is, actually represents a meaningful decline from where this season peaked. In the government's July update, the national active fire count stood at 796, just 4 short of 800, with 60 separate fires classified as out of control at that time, roughly double the number still out of control today. That July peak is the moment this season earned its reputation, when nearly 800 separate fires were burning across the country at the exact same time, stretching firefighting resources from coast to coast to coast. The season total at that point stood at 3,137 fires and 1.4 million hectares burned, meaning the roughly 3,000 additional hectares burned and more than 1,600 additional fires recorded since then reflect a full month of continued, grinding fire activity even as the raw peak count has come down from its high point. It helps to understand exactly what these classifications mean, since they are the framework Canadian fire agencies use to communicate risk and allocate resources across the country. The Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre sorts every active fire into one of 3 categories. Out of control means a fire is actively spreading and has not been contained in any meaningful way. Being held means a fire is not currently spreading beyond its known boundaries and is expected to stay within existing control lines under present conditions, though it has not yet been fully extinguished. Under control means a fire is fully contained and not expected to spread any further, even if crews remain on site, monitoring it. The 31 fires currently out of control represent the smallest, most volatile slice of the 582 total, but they are also the ones consuming the largest share of firefighting resources and carrying the greatest risk of sudden, unpredictable growth. The epicenter of the worst of this summer's activity was northwestern Ontario, and it is worth walking through exactly what happened there, because the human toll in that specific region was severe, even though, remarkably, it did not include mass casualties. In mid-July, a combination of prolonged heat, low humidity, and dry conditions that had been building across the region for weeks finally caught fire in earnest. Environment Canada placed much of northern Ontario under a severe heat warning during the critical stretch, with daytime highs reaching 36 degrees Celsius and a humidex, factoring in humidity, pushing the perceived temperature as high as 40 degrees. By the middle of July, At least 150 separate wildfires were burning across northwestern Ontario. A concentration of fire activity officials and Indigenous leaders in the region described as unlike anything they had seen before. By the 26th of July, Ontario's own Aviation, Forest Fire, and Emergency Services Agency was still tracking 130 active fires across the same region, giving a sense of just how sustained this particular outbreak actually was. The single most devastating individual loss during that stretch struck Namaigusi-Sagagun First Nation, also known as Collins First Nation, a community west of the town of Armstrong, roughly 250 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. According to residents, a wildfire overwhelmed the community so quickly that it destroyed much of the settlement in under an hour, after flames jumped the natural brakes that would normally have slowed its advance. 15-year-old Mia Pavala, daughter of the community's chief, described getting a call telling her the entire community needed to evacuate, and recalled watching the fire go from distant smoke to flames just around the corner from her home in a matter of minutes. With no time for an organized, vehicle-based evacuation, community members grabbed what they could, including family pets, and fled across the adjacent lake in a handful of boats packed to capacity, driving away as their entire community burned behind them. Everyone in the community made it out safely. By the time officials assessed the fire's full extent later that week, it had grown to more than 350,000 hectares. Linda DeBassage, Grand Council Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation, later relayed an account from a chief who visited the site afterward, describing the aftermath as looking like a war zone, with nothing left for returning community members to sift through but ash. Namaigusi-Sagagun was far from the only community forced to flee that same stretch of fire activity. White Sand First Nation, Lac des Mille Lacs First Nation, and Gakiji-Wanong Anishinaabe Nation were all placed under evacuation orders around the same time, alongside non-Indigenous communities across the Rainy River District and the town of Armstrong. Abamitung First Nation, also known as Fort Hope, became the subject of a formal federal military response. Ontario submitted a precautionary request for federal assistance on the 15th of July, and the Canadian Armed Forces confirmed receiving that request 2 days later, approving the deployment of airlift capacity along with liaison and coordination personnel to support the community's evacuation. That support began on the 18th of July with 4 Royal Canadian Air Force CC-130 Hercules transport aircraft used to move Fort Hope residents out of the path of the advancing fire and to safety. Evacuated residents from across the region were ultimately scattered to host communities throughout the province, including Niagara Falls, Toronto, Barrie, Sudbury, and Thunder Bay, relying on the support of those host communities to shelter people who, in some cases, no longer had homes to return to at all. The disproportionate weight of this crisis on Indigenous communities specifically is not a coincidental pattern this year. It reflects a documented, ongoing trend. According to analysis from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, part of the Norwegian Refugee Council, First Nations people make up roughly 5% of Canada's total population, yet have accounted for approximately 42% of all wildfire-related evacuations. Many of the hardest hit communities, including Namaigusi-Sagagun, are fly-in communities with limited road access, meaning evacuation options are inherently more constrained and more dependent on aircraft and boats than they would be for a community connected by highway. Linda DeBassage noted that fire activity affecting these communities has been increasing over multiple consecutive years, not appearing suddenly in isolation this season, and expressed her own view that what the region experienced this July reflect as a direct impact of the broader changes affecting the climate the region depends on. The response to this season's fires has drawn on resources well beyond Canada's own borders. Over the course of the summer, more than 500 international firefighters drawn from Mexico, Costa Rica, New Zealand, and Australia deployed to assist crews in Ontario and British Columbia specifically, working alongside Canadian firefighters and emergency responders to protect communities and critical infrastructure during the worst of the activity. On the funding side, the federal government has committed $316.7 million over 5 years, specifically to expand aerial firefighting surge capacity through the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, including the leasing of 10 additional aerial firefighting aircraft, alongside a separate commitment of $108 million over 3 years to renew the humanitarian workforce program responsible for large-scale emergency personnel deployment during disasters like this one. British Columbia also saw a significant fire, including a wildfire near Vernon in the province's southern interior, that required sustained ground crew response through early August, with photos released by the BC Wildfire Service showing crews working directly at the fire's edge as it pushed toward populated areas of the Okanagan region. That activity was part of why British Columbia joined Ontario in requesting additional federal air support once provincial resources reached their own capacity, a request that reflects how this season stretched even well-resourced provincial fire agencies thin at multiple points simultaneously, rather than concentrating all of the pressure in a single region. Emergency management in Canada is structured as a shared responsibility across every level of government, with provinces and territories retaining primary responsibility for fire response within their own borders and only formally requesting federal support once their own capacity has been exceeded, which is exactly the threshold both Ontario and British Columbia crossed at different points this summer. The smoke from the season's fires has traveled far beyond the communities directly threatened by flame, becoming a genuinely continental story in its own right. During the Saso worst of the northwestern Ontario activity in mid-July, smoke pushed Toronto's air quality to levels ranking among the worst recorded anywhere in the world that day, with the thick haze visibly reducing visibility across the city's skyline and prompting air quality health warnings for one of Canada's largest metropolitan areas. NASA satellite tracking documented that same smoke plume traveling well beyond Canada's own borders between the 14th and 19th of July, spreading air quality alerts across the upper Midwest and Northeast United States, affecting major metropolitan areas as smoke drifted across the Great Lakes region and toward the eastern seaboard. The mechanism behind that long-range transport is straightforward atmospheric physics. Wildfire smoke that reaches high enough into the atmosphere can be carried by prevailing wind patterns for thousands of kilometers before it descends back toward ground level, which is exactly why a fire burning in a remote, sparsely populated stretch of northwestern Ontario can still degrade the air quality of a city as large and as far away as New York. This pattern, Canadian wildfire smoke degrading air quality as far away as New York City and other major American population centers, has become a recurring feature of recent Canadian fire seasons, and 2026 has continued that trend rather than breaking from it. It is worth placing this season in its proper historical context, because the picture is more nuanced than a single number can capture. The 2023 Canadian wildfire season remains the benchmark against which every subsequent year gets measured, an extraordinary record-setting season that ultimately burned 18.5 million hectares nationally, by far the worst on record, and a season whose smoke reached as far as Europe, killing 8 people directly and forcing evacuations estimated at somewhere between 185,000 and 232,000 people at the height of that crisis. The 2025 season, by comparison, burned roughly 8.78 million hectares by mid-September, with 2 civilian deaths recorded in Manitoba and more than 85,000 people evacuated over the course of that year. 2024 burned about 5.4 million hectares for the full year. Measured strictly against those recent benchmarks, 2026's 4.1 million hectares burned so far genuinely does sit below the most recent several years' pace, and federal officials have been straightforward in describing the season's overall area burned as running below the 5-year average. What makes 2026 a genuinely significant season regardless is not that it has broken records for total area burned. It clearly has not, but the sheer number of individual, often fast-moving fires it has produced, the speed and severity with which several of them overran specific communities like Namaygusussagagun, and the concentrated, disproportionate impact those fires have had on Indigenous communities specifically, a pattern the raw hectare total alone does not capture. Looking ahead, federal forecasters are not describing this season as finished, even with the national active fire count having come down from its July peak. Environment and climate change. Canada's own seasonal outlook points to above average. Temperatures continuing across much of the country through the remainder of summer, with fire danger specifically expected to remain highest across the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and northern Manitoba through the end of August. Dry conditions are expected to persist specifically across Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. The same general region that produced this season's worst community-level devastation, meaning the elevated risk in exactly that area is not considered to be behind us. Federal officials have been explicit that these conditions, combined with ongoing drought and dryness in parts of the country, mean elevated wildfire risk is likely to persist for weeks yet, stretching into early fall before the season's natural wind down finally arrives. It is also worth pausing on the human cost beyond property and displacement, because it has not been zero this season. A firefighter died battling a wildfire in Annapolis County, Nova Scotia, early in the season, a reminder that behind every one of this year's statistics sits real personnel risking their own safety directly, not just structures and hectares on a map. Thousands of residents across multiple provinces have spent parts of this summer displaced from their homes entirely, with an unknown number, particularly in communities like Namaygusussagagun, facing the prospect of rebuilding from nothing once conditions finally allow people to return. So, what does all of this actually mean for you, whether you live in Canada directly or simply downwind of it? It means understanding that a declining national active fire count, from nearly 800 in July down to 582 today, reflects real progress in containing individual fires, but does not mean the underlying conditions. Driving the season, sustained heat, low humidity, and dry vegetation across large parts of the country have actually resolved, particularly across the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and northern Manitoba, where forecasters expect danger to remain elevated through the end of the month. It means recognizing that Indigenous communities, and fly-in communities in particular, continue to bear a wildly disproportionate share of this crisis's human cost, accounting for a share of evacuations nearly 9 times larger than their share of Canada's overall population, a pattern worth understanding rather than treating this season's fires as an evenly distributed national event. And if you live anywhere in the Great Lakes region, the upper Midwest, or the northeastern United States, it means understanding that Canadian wildfire smoke reaching your own city's air quality readings is not a rare or freak occurrence at this point. It is a now recurring feature of the summer season that is very likely to happen again before this particular fire season is finished. The honest, grounded summary is this. Canada currently has 582 active wildfires, burning nationally, including 31 out of control, down from a July peak of nearly 800 fires burning simultaneously, with the season's total now standing at 4,793 fires and 4.1 million hectares burned, a pace that remains below the 5-year average, despite this year producing more individual fires than the comparable point last year. The worst single stretch of this season struck northwestern Ontario in mid-July, where more than 150 simultaneous fires overwhelmed several First Nations communities, destroying Namaigussisagagan First Nation in under an hour and forcing thousands of residents into evacuation, with First Nations communities accounting for roughly 42% of this season's evacuations, despite making up only about 5% of Canada's population. More than 500 international firefighters and significant new federal funding have supported the response, even as forecasters warn that elevated fire danger is expected to persist across parts of the country well into early fall. We are going to keep tracking this as the season continues, sourced the same way we did today, straight from the Government of Canada, the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, and the communities and firefighters actually living through this, not recycled, headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss the updates as conditions develop further, because based on this season's trajectory, both the fire count and the smoke reaching communities well beyond Canada's borders are very likely to keep making headlines before autumn finally brings this season to a close. And leave that comment below. Tell me if wildfire smoke has affected your own city this summer, wherever you are watching from. Because behind every one of these numbers is a 15-year-old girl in Ottawa who got a phone call telling her not to panic, and panicked anyway. A community that escaped across a lake by boat as their entire home burned down behind them in under an hour, and a firefighting crew from Costa Rica or New Zealand right now, thousands of kilometers from home, working a fire line in a